Thursday, December 16th, 1937. The fourth day. 27. Ling awoke before the sun rose, the pre-dawn wind cutting through his thin clothes and chilled him to the bone. The skin of his face felt so dry and parched as if at the slightest touch it would crumble apart. From the hot, burning sensation in his ears, he knew that the chilblains he had developed were getting worse. It happened almost every winter since he had become a soldier. When spring came with its first gentle breeze, his ears would turn red and itch relentlessly. By mid-spring, when yellow-green shoots began to sprout from trees and the flowers began to bud, the old dead skin would shed a tiny piece at a time to reveal a new layer of tender, soft skin underneath. His hands were tied behind his back and had gone completely numb. He couldn't feel his fingers, not even the wound on his heavily bandaged hand. His hands. He had used all kinds of weapons, rifles, pistols, machine guns, even swords and knives, and wielded them with skill. But now his hands were useless. They had once been capable hands, not just for fighting, but for many other things too: writing, painting, holding his wife, carrying his son on his back, and doing majestic tricks to make his precious daughter shriek with laughter. But he had used them to kill, too. They were just about all used up. It's one thing to kill your enemies in combat, he reasoned, but quite another to kill when your enemies have already thrown their hands up in the air. Even during the warlord era, he had let go many an enemy combatant who had surrendered. Only once had he killed an enemy who had already been wounded, a poor lad who lay on the ground, his head resting against a shriveled tree trunk. He had a hole the size of a coin right through his throat. His face was white and nearly drained of blood. His eyes stared blankly ahead, and his wound bubbled as he tried to speak. "Kill me, kill me," the lad had begged in a weak voice. Ling put a bullet into the lad's temple and released him from his pain. The last thing he would tolerate would be soldiers preying on innocent civilians. It was a principle he adhered to way back when he was still a junior officer in the Nationalist Army. He had been so furious when he happened upon several of his soldiers looting away at Jingling College 10 years ago during the Northern Expedition. He would have shot them instantly if they had not immediately dropped their spoils. He marched them back to the barracks and had them whipped in front of everyone. He had done the whipping, and it was his hands that had gotten him into trouble with the Japanese. It was yesterday afternoon when he was dozing at the University of Nanking Hospital when several dozen Japanese soldiers swaggered into the ward and ordered all the patients out of bed. They were looking for former Chinese soldiers, one bed at a time, one patient at a time. Soon it became clear that almost all young and middle-aged men in the ward would be suspected of having been soldiers before. They were hauled from the beds and taken away. "I'm not a soldier," Ling had protested once they had arrived at his bedside. "I'm a teacher." A young Japanese officer grabbed his unbandaged hand and squeezed it hard. Ling winced in pain. The young officer only smiled. "Look, hands! No teacher! Liar!" He grabbed Ling by the collar and slapped him hard across the face. Ling staggered. He could feel the Japanese officer's fingerprints cutting through his skin and burning permanent, shameful marks on his bones. It was the first time Ling had been so close to the enemy he had fought so hard in the last few months. "If only I have a weapon in my hand," he thought. "A pistol, a sword, anything." The sword dangling at the officer's whip is so close, so tempting. No, he decided, Not here, not now. It would be suicidal, and it would hurt so many innocent people here. Ling got hold of himself. Poor little Chao. He looked the perfect age for a young soldier. The Japanese didn't even look at his hands, but had just taken him away. The two of them had been tied up and were led out of the ward with the others. Now, with the bone-chilling morning air slicing through his clothes, Ling rose to his feet and limped a long procession of fellow prisoners. Without even looking back, he knew Little Chao was close behind him, trampling hard. From the smoke and fire of China Gate to the mad, dizzy journey to the hospital, and now, ultimately, to this slow march to a certain cold death. He had not thought it would end like this. In the hospital, he longed to see his wife, his son, his daughter, and his new son-in-law. He should have left with Little Chao and not have lingered for so long. One day earlier, and he would not have been caught. As he plodded along on this cold December morning, Ling felt wave after wave of throbbing pain pounding against his head. He looked about. There were men and women, all laboring ahead silently, head and eyes downcast. Behind him, the procession reached back at least 200 meters. There were 5 columns, and Japanese troops marched along, rifles pointed toward the ground. But there was no use in trying to break free. In front of him, to the right, an officer rode atop a magnificent horse. His sword dangled at his hip. The horse blew blasts of hot vapor into the crisp morning air. Last night they had all been locked up in a cold, damp warehouse. The group taken from the hospital had joined a larger procession of prisoners this morning. The Japanese had rounded up everyone. It made no difference whether they were soldiers or not. Some of the women were taken away from the group and did not return. The children wailed and were left to wander the streets. Now the pale morning light began to flood the sky behind the Purple Mountain. The procession turned west, marching along streets littered with debris. As they marched on, the small houses grew sparse and the land opened up. Ling knew they were headed toward West Watergate. He looked up, and his heart sank. Ahead, he could see that they were being led to a huge pit, both deep and wide. There were already many Japanese soldiers setting up machine guns along its perimeter. They drew closer, and he saw the crumbled bodies which lay at the bottom of the pit, and a savage stench of death rose up to meet his nostrils. Ling held his breath. There were soldiers there, and many civilians. Their bodies had been shredded to pieces by bullets. Animals had come in the night and had strewn the entrails about. Bodies and parts of bodies lay in heaps, crumbled and twisted, mouths agape, with empty eyes staring out from half-blown apart heads, looking skyward for some salvation. The men and women in the procession began to moan audibly, and some dropped to their knees to retch violently before wailing in utter despair. Ling's heart raced. He had no weapons, no chance. They were all going to die. The columns had now lined up on all 4 sides of the pit. There were 5 rows of about 40 people on each side. Ling could see Little Chao standing in front of him, a little to his left. He was looking at his shoes, but he was shaking violently. "Okay," Ling managed to whisper. The young man gave a quick nod. His teeth chattered. Poor Little Chao. There was nothing he could do to help him. He still remembered the first day they met nearly 2 months ago. They desperately needed new recruits to replace the heavy losses suffered from the area bombings. Little Chao had never shot a gun before. However, he was young, fast, and smart. Ling took to him at once. It turned out that Little Chao was from the north. His family, like hundreds of thousands of other northerners, had joined the exodus of refugees after the incident at the Marco Polo Bridge outside Peking, where the Japanese army began to march to the rest of China. They had fled quickly, always staying a day or two ahead of the advancing Japanese army. But the warplanes quickly overran them, and he had lost his little sister in Shanghai during a bombing raid. He made it with his parents to Nanking, but they were killed soon after. In Nanking, Little Chao had resolved to stand his ground defiantly. He would have made a great soldier. Ling stood in silence. He winced as his head throbbed and his mind raced faster than he could comprehend. He had never looked back before, but now that certain death loomed in front of him, with no hope of escape, the darkest recesses of his soul were suddenly laid bare. He could see a kid huddled in a bag, blindfolded, gagged, both hands tied in the bag, both of his little legs being bound too. There is the sound of squeaking wooden wheels grinding slowly along a stone street. How did the kid end up in the bag? Ling didn't know. It was night, and the image faded to a blur, drowsily floating under the pale light of a hazy moon hanging low on the horizon. But he could hear sounds, gongs and horns, as if a parade were passing through the street of Nanking, or a troupe of traveling entertainers trailed by dozens of neighborhood kids. Two kids emerged from the shadows, following the commotion of joyous noise and dancing festival lights. Oblivious to their surroundings, they followed the procession in jubilation. A rickety old wagon drawn by a sick-looking donkey moves slowly along a narrow, pebbled street, its wheels grinding their way into darkness. One of the kids is on the cart, in the bag. The kid wakes up later, but he finds his parents at his bedside. A different smell is in the air. Incense sticks have been placed in a brazier on a nearby table, the thin wisps curling upward. "Oh, you've come back," cries his mother. Slowly she begins to feed him chicken broth. It tastes salty and delicious. "Yes, eat well and rest well," says his father. A few days later, everything is fine, but somehow the kid knows that everything here is different. Everything. "It's your fever," says his father. "It must have done something to your memory." "We were so worried because you're such a special gift to us. A gift from Guan Yin herself." "Guan Yin?" he exclaimed in wonder. "The goddess of mercy." His parents pull up his little jacket. "Look here," they tell him, pointing to his belly. "It's a gift from Guan Yin." On his belly is a small purple birthmark. He remembers it well. Everyone says it looks like a bird. "It is," he laughs. So there it was at last. Ling opened his eyes again. The pit of death yawned and bloated before him. He had never been convinced that he was a gift from Guan Yin, and the happy memories from his childhood quickly faded with the passing of the years. His parents only smiled blankly at his persistent queries, but soon even those faded. But in his soul of souls, he knew he was from some other place, abducted and sold to a family who had wanted a son to carry on their family line. His eyes welled with tears, and he blinked repeatedly. Ling filled his mind with happy thoughts, images of his soon-to-be-born grandchild. He would have no grave for them to visit, but for him, just to honor and show reverence to one's ancestors in some way was good enough. The Japanese officer atop the horse barked orders, and the soldiers forced all the prisoners to turn around so that they faced away from the pit. A single Japanese soldier was assigned to each column of 5 prisoners. Nearing certain death, the wails grew to a crescendo. Others stood silently, waiting for the inevitable. From the crowd nearby, a commotion erupted. Ling turned his head. A Japanese soldier was dragging a woman out from one of the prisoner columns. Her belly was fat, covered by a long flowing skirt. She dropped to the ground, screaming hysterically. Other soldiers turned and guffawed. The officer on the horse seemed unconcerned. The soldier dragged her to a mound of dirt next to the pit. He threw down his rifle and fell on top of her. "Beasts!" Ling muttered to himself. "Beasts!" But the woman fought fiercely. She bit and tore at the soldier's face, drawing blood. The other soldiers laughed hysterically at their naive comrade's predicament. Enraged, the soldier jumped up and spit at the woman, drawing still more laughs. He retrieved his rifle and lunged with its bayonet end at the woman's neck, but missed and stabbed instead the earth next to her head. She tried to raise her arms, but the soldier withdrew the bayonet from the dirt and plunged it into her chest, laying on it with all his weight, pushing it in deeply. She let out a blood-curdling scream, convulsed and writhed, nearly shaking the rifle out of the soldier's hands, and then stopped moving. The soldier cut open her belly with a bayonet, thrusting repeatedly, and picked up and tossed the pink and gray fetus into the pale, early morning light. Ling closed his eyes. "Little Chao," he whispered. "Yes," the young man replied, his teeth clattering. "Stay close behind me," he instructed. "When I fall in with me, understand?" The young man groaned between convulsive sobs. The officer on horseback gave an order, and the soldiers unsheathed their swords. Along the ring of prisoners surrounding the pit, the head-cutting began. Those furthest from the pit were killed first. Those kneeling next to them or behind them were awash with blood as each head was taken. As the soldiers wielding the swords progressed down the lines, another group of soldiers would follow at a safe distance, picking up the heads and arranging them neatly in rows. It was like some kind of a ritual. A soldier wielding the sword was coming to the prisoner right in front of Ling now. He paused for a moment to check his blade, then abruptly grabbed the hair of the man kneeling before him to straighten his neck, placed the blade on his shoulder, and then sliced deeply, back and forth once, then twice. The man's tight hands clenched and unclenched furiously amid the spray of blood. The warm, salty drops hit Ling in the face as the man's headless body fell forward. The soldier now swaggered back for Ling. This was the end, then. Hui Ping, Helen, Dongzi, and Peng Fei, I'll see you again. Ling felt a hand clutch his hair. He closed his eyes. Something cold and sharp bit into the back of his neck. A second later, it turned hot and sticky. "Little Chao!" He rushed into the air as if weightless. Drifting downward, he was a withered leaf caught in an icy wind. Darkness closed in.